Let's start with some depressing information. Seems about right, right? Social isolation is an interesting thing, isn't it? Over the last couple of years, it has become a much more common conversation to talk about isolation, to talk about the ways in which things are changing around us. There's loneliness, there's depression, there's anxiety. All of these things seem to be increasing. Conversation around these things seems to be increasing. And it was going that way up until COVID, and then that kind of just escalated. It's grown exponentially since then. These are now conversations that we're hearing all the time. It's coming up in all sorts of different contexts, all sorts of different ways, and it's just becoming more and more commonplace, which means that we're also having more research and more study of these things. There's more information about these issues that's coming out, and so that's kind of a neat thing that we can now kind of see some of the research that's coming from them. And this is some of the information that's coming out. I found this study on our oldest generation. So the oldest people within our culture. This is a secular study. This isn't done by church, but they're looking at our oldest people. We're talking 65 and older. And here's some things that they've found. They found that if you are socially isolated, it increases your risk of premature death in a similar fashion to as if you were smoking, obese, or physically inactive. Which is surprising to me, right? That there is a physical consequence to being isolated socially, that it actually wears on your body physically. We're told that there's a 50% increase in risk of dementia. There's a 29% increased risk of heart disease, 32% increased risk of stroke, all from being socially isolated. That's interesting, isn't it? And there's a whole lot more. There's way more statistics on all this stuff. As I was reading through them and looking at them, I'm going through, and in the back of my mind, I want to know what's their solution. As our culture, as the secular world around us is looking and trying to figure out that these things exist, and they're studying and they're trying to understand them better and better, I want to know what their solution is. I want to know what they're going to put forth. And it gets really even more sad to me. As I'm reading through this stuff, I get down to the bottom of the page and I ask this question: what can you do if you're experiencing loneliness? And their answer is that you should find their pamphlets about research on loneliness. It's empty, and it's hollow. Our culture struggles with the solution to loneliness. This isn't a church problem. We have the answer. But our culture around us can recognize the problem, and they haven't figured it out. It's not just our oldest generation. It's our youngest generation as well. Our school systems have seen that there is a correlation between students and their academic success and their involvement in something outside of the classroom. So if they're part of a team, if they're part of a club or a council, if they're part of a youth group in their local church, that those kids tend to do better academically. And so it stands to reason, in my opinion, that the schools will become pretty passionate about getting their kids plugged into some sort of a community, get them on a team, get them involved in something, and yet it doesn't really happen. There's no tracking, there's no investment, there's no system in place to help children get placed in those kinds of environments. Our current Surgeon General is a guy named Dr. Murthy. I'm saying that because I don't want to figure out what his first name is, all right? Dr. Murthy. He's done a lot of research in this, and he's looked a lot at our youth and what's taking place among them, and he believes that loneliness is a public health concern, that it's a significant issue with them. In fact, he says that the greatest epidemics that we're facing as a culture, so we're talking about like drug and alcohol abuse within our youth, we're talking about violence, we're talking about depression and anxiety, that all of these things actually stem from loneliness. He also did some research and he found that 46% of students felt or saw, they witnessed or felt social isolation on a weekly basis. And that isolation is felt strongest online, which is curious to me because it's called social media, right? It's supposed to bring us together. It's supposed to connect us, but in fact what it does is actually makes us feel more and more isolated. That's interesting, isn't it? And if you've paid any attention at all, if you're a parent, you've probably seen teen suicide, that's on a terrifying rise. It's in the news on a weekly basis. It has been the last couple days of the things that take place on social media and on the internet, how our kids are interacting in those places that are supposed to bring them together are actually making them feel more and more isolated. Research is showing that our oldest and that our youngest are significantly hurt by loneliness. But it's not just them, it's all of us in between as well. That this is something that is across the board. This isn't an age issue, it's a human issue. And while our secular world is identifying it, they're using science and they're using research and they're kind of figuring it out, and I think they're doing it accurately. I think they figured out what's taking place. It took the Bible less than 2 chapters to say the same thing. God figured it out pretty quickly. And he didn't just identify the problem, but he solved it pretty quickly too. Genesis chapter 2, God looks at Adam and he says, it's not good for the man to be alone. It's not good. Now there's some huge ideas here, all right? This simple sentence, this simple little line in Genesis chapter 2, there's some big, massive ideas of things that are taking place just in this little statement. Stuff like this. In the previous chapter, God had said this. He said, let us make man in our image. God said, let us make man in our image. That God, when he was doing this work, he wasn't doing it alone. That there was community within the nature of God. We have God, the Word, and the Spirit working in Genesis chapter 1, creating all things. We call him God the Father and the Son of Jesus, right? And the Holy Spirit. We recognize that there's these parts. There is a community aspect, a communal aspect of who God is. So when he designs us, he makes us in his image. And it's not a physical thing, it's a soul thing, it's a spiritual thing. That we bear this same need, this same responsibility for community. And when God sees Adam alone, he recognizes it's not good for him to be alone. He needs community. There's other ideas in this. I mean, there's a truth to this statement in a physical sense, in an emotional sense, in a mental sense. These are all true. It's what our secular world outside of the church is finding out. They're doing all this research and they're realizing that it's not good for the man to be alone, but it's bigger than that. It's not good spiritually for you to be alone. It's not good spiritually to be alone. The last couple of weeks as Doc's been preaching, he's had this kind of idea, and it's almost kind of thrown in as an extra. If you haven't been paying super close attention, you've probably missed it. But Doc has said something along these lines multiple times the last couple of weeks. He's said that our spiritual health is more important than our physical health. And as a culture, they're looking around, they're seeing this stuff, and they're trying to figure out, they're identifying it, they don't really know how to solve it. In the church, we have these answers. And we also recognize this. We recognize that of all the answers that the world wants to come up with, they can't even begin to compete when it comes to the spiritual answer. We're the ones who hold that whole area to ourselves. Potentially the greatest area of health that suffers when we're isolated and when we're lonely is our spiritual health, and it's because of this. Sin takes place in secret, doesn't it? That's what we do. And when we sin in secret, we carry shame and guilt in secret. And they feed each other, don't they? And it creates this paranoia within us. And we suffer slowly, agonizingly in isolation. There's a lot of ways that this is played out. Tons of examples. I'll give you 2. I believe that one of the most haunting verses in the entire Bible is 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1. It's terrifying. There's this guy named David in the Old Testament. He starts out as a shepherd boy. He becomes this great warrior. He eventually even becomes king. Everything he does is good. Everything he touches works. He's successful in everything. He's built this great nation. The nation is safe. Other nations fear him. Everyone's happy and content. Everything is good. And then you find this verse and everything shifts. There is a seismic shift in his life and a seismic shift in the nation in this one verse. It's 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army, but David remained in Jerusalem. Did you guys hear that? That wasn't just me, right? Listen, The Bible is alive, guys, and there's stuff in there. When you read it, there needs to be a soundtrack sometimes, okay? And I want you to know, when you read that verse, this is ominous, this is haunting. This isn't just some passive little detail. This is setting something up. This is building something that's huge, all right? It's giving you big ideas beneath the surface of a story. Something significant is happening here. Something is changing. When it was normal for kings, it's springtime, it's time to go kill each other. So the kings go off to war, and they go out, and David is usually out there, and he's with his guys, and they know him. He has this intimacy with the men that he's fought with for years. He knows them closely, but this time he doesn't. This time he doesn't go out, and he stays behind. It makes me ask the question, I wonder why, right? And you don't have to wonder for long. The very next verse, David is standing on his balcony staring at a woman who isn't his wife. It's that quick. Almost as if he had planned it. He sees Bathsheba. He's isolated from his community. There's no one there to hold him accountable, no one there to catch him, and so he calls her over. They commit adultery. She becomes pregnant. He tries to cover it up. Doesn't work. He has to set up his friend to be killed on the battlefield. He has Bathsheba's husband Uriah killed on the battlefield to cover up his sin and what he's done. He marries Bathsheba thinking that's going to solve everything, but all it does is create more internal family conflict for generations. There's problems that stem from this one verse. When David chose to be isolated, it all shifted. It makes me think, when I read this, David remained in Jerusalem, I hear it is not good for man to be alone. It's not just David. It's Peter. You probably know the story of Peter when he has his worst moment of his life. It starts in the garden. Jesus is arrested and he's taken off. And every single one of the Gospels records the fact that Peter chooses to stay close by, that Peter chooses to kind of follow in secret in the shadows because he wants to know what's going to happen to Jesus. Matthew, Mark, Luke, they all tell this story. John tells a little bit different story. He says that he was with Peter. It's kind of interesting. That somehow John played a part, but they're not really together. John helps get Peter into where he can overhear what's going on and kind of see from a window, but John is somewhere else. He may be inside. It's all really kind of confusing, a little bit difficult to understand. But what we know is this: Peter finds himself in a courtyard outside of the room where Jesus is on trial. It's a fraud of a trial. It's a setup. And Peter isn't isolated in the sense that he's completely alone, but he is isolated from his community. And he's standing with these people. There's some soldiers there, there's some servants there, there's people around him, but he's alone, and they begin to identify him. They begin to ask if he is the one that they thought he was. Are you that guy who's a follower of Jesus? And he says no. He says no 3 times. And this becomes Peter's most embarrassing moment of his life. On his 3rd denial, he looks through a window and he catches eyes with Jesus. Jesus is on trial, but he's looking out the window at Peter, who has just betrayed him the 2nd time he'd be betrayed in one night. We're told that Peter weeps and he runs away. And it reminds me of Genesis chapter 2. It isn't good for man to be alone. I wonder, what if David had gone to war? What if David had died at war? Would it have been better for him to suffer physically than to have suffered spiritually the way that he did? I wonder about Peter. What if John had stayed with him in the courtyard? What if Andrew, Peter's brother, had actually come with him and the 2 of them were standing in the courtyard together? I wonder what he would have done. I wonder if there would have been that same denial. I wonder if there would have been the strength to be faithful in that moment. Don't forget what happens in these guys' stories, because this isn't the end. Their stories go forward. There's a guy in David's life named Nathan. He's a friend, and he's a prophet. Nathan comes along and confronts. He has the guts to confront David on what it is that he has done. And we love David. We continue to celebrate David and his influence, his leadership, his love of God because of moments like this. When he's confronted, he confesses, he admits, he repents, and he still faces consequences. Life doesn't get better for him. As I said, life becomes disaster for him. Lots of things go wrong, but he gets this one right. He makes things right with his God. He confesses, and it all starts because one person came along and was willing to help hold him accountable because a friend stood by his side. Genesis 2 says it isn't good for man to be alone. I like this though, Psalm 133. How good and pleasant it is when brothers live together in unity. What I love about this is David wrote it. David wrote this. And I wonder, like, did David write this when he was a shepherd out on the hills by himself with his sheep and he was lonely and he just wished he had his friends? Or did he write this when he was an old man looking back at his life and recognizing the value of having a community close by? And that's not the end of Peter's story either. In Acts chapter 4, there's this story. This is a few months later. Peter and John are going through the community in Jerusalem and they're healing people and they're preaching about Jesus. They're using his name all over the place. They're making a big deal about who he is, and the Sanhedrin calls them in. The Sanhedrin is kind of the political leaders of the Jewish religion. They have some authority. And they demand that Peter and John stop preaching in the name of Jesus. And Peter and John looked them in the face on their own trial. Now remember, Peter wasn't on trial in the courtyard and he couldn't hold up to it. Now he is. Now he is on trial. And Peter and John look these men in their face, the men who have authority to hurt them. And they say, what should we do? Should we obey God or obey you? It's powerful. It's a different moment, right? And look, there's some things that had happened in Peter's life that had changed him to this point. From the time that he's in the courtyard until he's standing before the Sanhedrin in Acts 4, some very significant things had happened in his life. Starting first and foremost with the fact that he saw a resurrected Jesus. That's going to change someone, all right? He'd experienced that. That was real. And there's the way that God had kind of brought him back, the restitution he made with him. He has this weird breakfast with fish on the beach, and it's this a really fascinating story, but he restores Peter back to his position. That was a powerful moment. And there's this thing in Acts chapter 2 where the Holy Spirit comes and falls on the disciples, and the Spirit begins moving in their lives, and they're doing stuff that they thought only Jesus could do. I mean, in Acts chapter 4, Peter is not the same man that he was in the courtyard. That's fair. But also, don't discount the fact that when he's standing in Acts chapter 4, he has a friend right by his side. Don't ignore the fact that maybe one of the biggest changes that happened in his life was that he made sure he didn't go things alone anymore, but that he made sure he was always with someone to do the work of Jesus together. That's a life-changing difference. And also don't miss what else happens in Acts 4. Peter and John are dismissed from the Sanhedrin. They go immediately to church. They find their community. They come in. They report everything that had just happened. And as the church hears it, they break into a prayer meeting. They immediately take it to God and they begin praying. And the words of Genesis 2 are like haunting me. They're there, just kind of back there. It isn't good for man to be alone, but look at what the church says. The church gets together and they pray and they say, Lord, consider their threats and enable your servants to speak your word with great boldness. That's a big difference, isn't it? There's a big difference between Peter in the courtyard and Peter with the church in Acts chapter 4. This prayer of boldness, it happens in community and it's lived out in community. You can pray for boldness in isolation. You can ask God to make you bold and to give you a heart that's going to be bold for him. You can pray that in isolation, but you're going to find strength for boldness in community. And there's examples of that all throughout Scripture. Now, it would be wise in this moment to pause for just a second and recognize that there's something I've left out of this conversation. I've spoken of community as if any community is good community. The reality is that not all community is created equal. Even our secular world would agree with that there's ways in which we engage in community that aren't actually to our best interests, that sometimes the people we surround ourselves are actually a detriment to us. Paul would say in the New Testament, he says, bad company corrupts good morals. Some of you need to be a little bit lonelier. You have people in your life who are not leading you towards Jesus, they're actually leading you away from him. And it looks like this. If you are that Eagles fan, if you're, Ben Jeffries, God love him wherever he's at, that guy. If you're that kind of a fan, and a Chiefs fan invited you over to their Super Bowl party, it's probably not the one you want to go to, right? That's not the community that you want. I'm wearing a Raiders jersey today. I don't love the Raiders. I love Jerry Rice, all right? But I'm wearing a Raiders jersey. If you're a Chiefs fan, you're probably not inviting me over today, right? Not all community is the same. You don't want to find it in every single place, and vice versa. If you're a Chiefs fan, you're probably not going to an Eagles house tonight, right? Because not all community is created the same. In fact, why don't you watch this video? All right, you didn't know what you were looking for, so we have to watch it again, all right? Watch the dad, watch the Broncos dad and the kid. Watch how it sets up, the whole crowd. Everyone's doing it. Man, he wants in. No. We don't do that. That kid had found community. He had found his people. And his dad says, no, this is not our people, right? This is not our community. We don't do that. And I love that the kid just drops his hands. And his heart breaks a little bit. For the rest of his life, he will love the Chiefs, but never admit it to his father, right? Look, sometimes we just talk about the value of community and we miss the fact that not all community is good community. There's a story in the Old Testament about a guy named Rehoboam that, for practical sake, he proves to be one of the biggest fools in the Bible. David is king. He has a son named Solomon with Bathsheba. David dies. Solomon becomes king. Solomon eventually dies. His son Rehoboam takes over as king. And when he takes over, he has an opportunity to surround himself with the advisors who had helped his father. Okay? Solomon is called one of the wisest men to ever live, the wisest man to ever live. Can you imagine the value of his advisors? And Rehoboam has the opportunity to surround himself with them. They offer themselves to come and to support him and help him to lead the nation. And Rehoboam pushes them away for his buddies. Like literally, kids his age who don't have a clue, who give awful advice. And literally days into him becoming the king, the nation is split and they're at civil war. Not all community is created equal. Proverbs 27:17 says, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. It's a powerful verse. Here's the truth. You're going to be sharpened by the community that you invest in. This is true especially of your spiritual community, which means that if you're not surrounding yourself with people who want to follow Jesus as badly as you want to follow Jesus, you're not going to get sharpened towards Jesus. You're going to get dulled into this world. Iron sharpens iron. Iron also dulls other things. If you're surrounding yourself with people who are looking to dull you, you will find yourself not as focused on your Jesus. Hebrews 10:25 says it this way, let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing. That's a slow process of dulling, that we slowly just become different. We slowly just give up being together. But let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Sharpening happens when we're together. It's not something that happens while we're apart. We have to be together, and when we come together, we have this opportunity to sharpen one another. And if you think that the world is getting worse, as you look forward to this day approaching, and you think we're in this spiral downward at whatever level you think it is, all the more reason, all the more purpose for you to be serious about pursuing relationship, pursuing community with other followers of Jesus. You're either being sharpened or you're being dulled. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14 says, do not be yoked together with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? What fellowship can light have with darkness? Light and dark don't really mix very well together, do they? Righteousness and wickedness, they don't really have much of a partnership, do they? Paul writes here to the Corinthians, he's like, look, you've got to surround yourself with people who are pulling towards Jesus. You've got to pull each other together. It's what Doc has made famous here at this church of saying that we're just trying to drag each other to heaven. This is what it should look like, that we're part of a community. This isn't something that we do in isolation. This isn't something that we do on our own, but that we do it in the context of family. We do it in the context of community with our church. And this is oftentimes used in the terms of marriage. It's absolutely true there, but it's bigger than that. This isn't just about make sure you marry someone who believes the same things you do. I think this applies to where you work. I think this applies with your poker buddies on Friday night. Like this applies in every context that you're going to put yourself into. Are you putting people on your inner circle who are yoked equally to you? Are they going to help pull you to heaven, or are they actually going to dull you? Are they going to make you to where you're insensitive to the leading of Jesus? Are they actually going to pull you in a direction that's going to lead you away from who Jesus is? Not all community is created equal. That's why at church we have a different answer. We have a different solution. We have a different emphasis on these things. What our culture around us can't figure out, we solved in the very beginning. It's community, like-minded people pulling together in the same direction. If you don't, you look a lot like Rehoboam. That's not good. This is why at Cap City we care so much about community. That's why it's such a big priority for us here. We believe that the biggest decision that you will ever make is to follow Jesus. It's the biggest decision you'll ever make. But the second biggest decision that you will ever make will be placing yourself in a situation where you are investing into a community of other people who are following Jesus. You hear that? The second biggest decision I think you can ever make is to choose to invest yourself into a community of other people who are also following Jesus. Not just attend, but invest. It's why we care about things around here that we call life groups. We really, truly, actually believe that you can't follow Jesus by yourself. We really believe that. And so we think that you'll do much better if you follow Jesus with other people, if you invest some time with them, with another group of people who are trying to do the same thing. And it may look as funny as a Raiders and a Chiefs fan living together. It may look as funny as Democrats and Republicans. There may be lots of things that make you look different within your group, but the thing that holds and binds you together, that you care most about, is Jesus, who's pulling you forward. And that you pull each other forward as well. It's why we care so much about things called growth groups. We do them on Wednesday nights and Sunday mornings, and there's other random times during the week when they meet. But we really seriously believe that something important happens when we learn with other people sitting next to us. We think that there's creativity, that there's accountability. We think there's partnership and encouragement. That all these things happen in a group, and they can't happen near as well as when you're alone. It's why we do something every month that we call Getting Started 101, which we did last week, and Getting Started 201, which we're doing today. We emphasize these things because the biggest decision you'll ever make is following Jesus. That's Getting Started 101. We want to lead people constantly to a place where we can get them into a relationship with Jesus. That's our biggest, most important goal. Our second most important goal is to get people to get into life groups, to get into community with other people. That's Getting Started 201. Because if we're just running around on our own, we're weak, we're vulnerable, we're isolated. We look like David on his own in Jerusalem. We look like Peter in the courtyard. We need that community around us. And so today we have Getting Started 201. We want to give you an opportunity. Maybe you've been here for a long time. Maybe you're new here. But you need community. You need a family. You need people to help you when you're your weakest. And you need to offer yourself to others to help them when they're at their weakest. That's what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus. I also want you to pay a special attention to this. I've used this word invest a lot. Community requires investment, and I want you to think of it in those kinds of terms. It looks like this. Today, we're all going to watch the Super Bowl. Some of us care a lot. Some of us not as much. We probably all have a team that we would like to win, or maybe you just have a team that you would really like to lose. That's where I'm at, okay? But no matter what, however this game goes tonight, I'm going to go to bed just fine. Like at the end of it, I'll shrug my shoulders, make some sort of comment, and then I'm going to go to bed. Right? Some of you won't be able to sleep tonight. You'll be so happy or you'll be so depressed, right? Because you've invested, you've spent money, you've spent time, you're wearing their stuff on their body. If we walk through your house, their stuff is on the walls, you've invested, you care a little bit more. When you've invested in something, you get more out of it, you feel it more deeply, don't you? It's like when you go to the bank, you can't withdraw funds unless you've deposited them first. You don't get the benefit of having money if you haven't put money in. Does that make sense? That's community. When life gets hard and you need friends to come along your side and help you out, it's too late to find community. You need to find community. You need to surround yourself with other Jesus followers now so that when it's time to make that withdrawal, that they're there and that they're available and willing to help. You see that? And yet, God can do some incredible things with the little that we invest, can't he? When we plug ourselves in, he does some really cool stuff with it. I want you to watch this video. This is from a family here within our church who went through a particularly rough moment in life here within the last year. And I want you to hear about the community and how it rallied around them.
Well, on the evening of September 30th, I remember it well, it was a Friday evening. He was coaching a middle school girls basketball game in Clark County, and he suffered a medical emergency. I was here actually at the church at that time and was quickly being contacted by members of our life group alerting me to the medical emergency.
When my episode happened, I just said to the individuals around me, and they knew something was wrong with me. They came over and took over.
Immediately, we rushed to Clark County, and by we, my daughter and myself. Clark County Memorial Hospital is where we met up with Dan, and later found out as they were doing multiple tests that he was having an aortic dissection, which is a form of an aortic aneurysm, and was immediately being life-flighted to UK Hospital from Clark County Regional. But in that moment, when Dan told me to contact, our closest friends, which really are, in our life group members, those folks are our family. We moved here about 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago. We do not have any blood family in this area, this region. We are 7 hours from either of our families. And so joining Capital City and, immediately seeking connections in life group, those folks have become our family. They immediately stepped in. How can we take care of your children to make sure that, they're cared for? How can we support you with food and supports and all of the things? And they didn't leave. They stayed with us. Dan went into emergency surgery pretty immediately after being there. His surgery lasted 14 hours. I don't know that I can imagine doing it alone, honestly. It was... It was hard. It was super hard to go through, knowing that this was a very, very serious situation.
And I think that's the part of the life group that's when you're in difficult need, that they come over and support you in any way, to help you, because today's world, it's hard. We all have to support each other.
I don't know how you go through life or difficult times or even the good times without being surrounded by those folks in your life that really love and care for you, like our life group does.